and rental and sales on Newstalk 1440 WROK.
Good morning, everybody. Dave Schmidt along with Matt Nestor and producer Tom Warner right here on the State Line Sports Hour. We're going to take a little trip down to Florida. Basically, like Matt said, we're on the phone, so it doesn't really count for us. A little chilly up here, but I'm sure it's nice down in Florida. And with us right now, we have Sunshine State Athletic Conference Director Stuart Weiss. And hey, Stuart, thanks for being on today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Hey, let's talk about what's going down in Florida. Your association basically has some conflicts with the Florida High School Athletic Association, but their biggest worry right now is the state legislature. Tell us a little bit of background on how this all affects you and what's going on down in Florida, if you can.
Well, right now we're trying to get a little bit of relief from the legislature. The way that the athletics work here in Florida is FHSAA is designated. It's a private organization, but it's designated by the state of Florida as the official athletic overseer for the state of Florida. And so, therefore, 99.9% of all of our schools are members of that organization. And unfortunately, when you give a quasi-monopoly to any organization, there's going to be some issues. And so right now we're trying to seek some relief through the legislature from FHSAA.
You know, as I read through some of the proposals in the bill, is it really about, when you talk about really trying to maybe not allow them to be able to make every single decision when it comes down to certain things, maybe trying to give some of the schools or the districts or the conferences the ability to maybe kind of police themselves in some areas?
Yeah, you got to remember, they have kind of a one-size-fits-all policy, and as times have changed, more people have gone to schools of choice, whether it's charter or private or even homeschooling kids. But the policies have not changed to coincide with that. And in most counties, if you transfer schools, a student is automatically ineligible for a year after transferring from playing athletics. That was implemented to try to prevent recruiting and, having schools recruit players to build powerhouses. But, in today's day and age, there's, kids with choices and parents and you name it. It just doesn't make sense to have that blanket policy.
When you started when the Sunshine State Athletic Conference was started, it was mainly some smaller high school football programs that just didn't want to go in the playoff system they had in FHSAA. Is that one of the keys in this whole thing, is to maybe give you guys a little bit more freedom to how you handle it and also be allowed to be a part of the Florida High School Athletic Association in some sports?
Yeah. Members of my conference, we have 29 members throughout the state of Florida that are members of my conference. They're also members of the FHSAA, and most of them are about 400 students or less in the high school, and they're unable to or unwilling to compete in districts because districts, honestly, right now are just, they can't compete. It's not a level playing field, and so they've paired themselves together. That's how the conference came about. We paired ourselves together with other schools that were like-minded, that were on the same level, and we compete amongst ourselves in our own conference.
What are some of the rules on recruiting? In the proposal it says that they're going to remain the same except with one exception. What are some of those rules that are in place that were supposed to try to prevent some of the transfers, which, quite frankly, I don't think they prevent that anymore unless you're talking about, somebody going into their senior year. So what are some of those rules in place when you look at the recruiting?
Well, the biggest thing when it comes to recruiting is coaches can't reach out and offer things to students. They can't entice them to come to their school with some sort of benefit, whether that be athletic scholarships or anything like that. They can't promise them specific things. The only way that transfers are allowed to happen is if there's a purpose for it. Perhaps parents get divorced and kid goes and lives with mom who's in a different district, then he's allowed to transfer. It can't be for the athletic purposes. Otherwise, it's considered recruiting or enticing.
So I guess how do you address that then? Because, as much as we'd like to think that some of these do fit into those certain circumstances, sometimes those circumstances do kind of line up with the education. So, what if a school, a kid just happens to transfer in, but then the school wants to offer them an athletic scholarship or something? Is that something you guys look into?
Yeah, we can't, in the state of Florida, you cannot offer athletic scholarships. There are other scholarships, if a child comes in and it needs some financial aid, if a child comes in and we have what they call McKay scholarships, which are for children who have some learning disabilities or learning shortfalls, and there's some state money that is provided to help give them education. You cannot offer athletic scholarships Now, there are ways that schools can get around that, and that's part of the problem. But, reality is right now in the environment that we are, and at least in Florida, I can't speak for Illinois, is parents pretty much have choice on where their student wants to go to school. And it's not fair to automatically remove that eligibility for that child to be able to participate in sports just because they move from one school to another. We have to remember that the greatest deterrent for kids dropping out of school is athletics. And so the last thing we want to do is remove that opportunity if that's going to help keep the kid in school and get them an education and move them forward.
We're talking with Sunshine State Athletic Conference Commissioner Stuart Weiss, and when you look at this whole thing, Florida High School Athletic Association may not be the sanctioned body if Florida legislators get their way. Now, how would that help you guys as they reorganize and do some things, and the state has a bigger say in all this, Stuart?
Well, I don't know if that would benefit us specifically. The way that the wording is in the language, and I've actually, meeting with the legislators for 4 weeks now and working with them, they're not actually trying to remove FHSAA. There's just been so many issues with FHSAA over the last 10 years that they wanted to basically put FHSAA on notice that, listen, if you're not going to shape things up and do things the way they're supposed to, we'll put it out there and seek another organization to be the official organization of athletic sports. I don't foresee that there's going to be any organization that's large enough. There's 700 schools right now that are in FHSAA, an organization large enough to manage that. Plus, I think they have 12, 14 sports that they offer. It just doesn't realistically. Probably not going to happen, but I think it was more along the lines of a shot across the bow of FHSAA to say that, we're tired of what's going on. If we have to, we'll take this step.
So I guess if you take that step, what's some of the solutions? I know when we look at here in Illinois, we've got a big divide between what happens in Chicago and what happens around the rest of the state. And I know that's where a lot of the problems with the IHSA come from, is that it doesn't seem to be a level playing field and there's two sets of rules. So I guess what are some of the solutions, if you're allowed to have a little bit more flexibility outside of the FHSAA?
Well, one thing that's worked well here in Florida is we now have 5 independent conferences, schools that have paired themselves together with other like-minded schools that are on the same level playing field, and they've formed themselves into their own conferences. The problem is FHSAA, instead of embracing it, has looked at us as being an enemy and a potential demise, I guess, of them because we're drawing so many schools into these private conferences. But honestly, my opinion, being in the middle of it is, let the schools have a lot more say in what they want to do and who they want to play. Allow them to put themselves together with other like-minded schools instead of using some arbitrary number system up in Gainesville to come up with the pairings of the teams. They have really no logic other than size of schools when it comes to putting schools together. And if you look at week to week, the competitions and the scores, there's very, very little level playing field. There's very few games out there that are actually even competitive. There's the haves and the have-nots.
You look at the Florida High School Athletic Association. You said you've been talking to legislative people for the last 4 weeks, discussing items about this. How has the FHSAA been with talking to the legislature, and also with you? How do they communicate with you? What are the situation on a one-to-one basis with that situation?
Well, that's part of the problem. We don't have any conversation with FHSAA. We've tried. FHSAA, again, when you give someone a quasi-monopoly, they don't feel the need to work or cooperate with anybody, and so that's why we've ended up having to go to legislature. The legislature, has been working with FHSAA as well. FHSAA is spending huge money on lobbyists to try to kill this bill, and honestly, right now, as we sit right now, I have doubts as to whether it's going to pass. It's going to make it out of the House without a problem, but right now we're having a terrible time in the Senate, even getting the bill heard in the Education Committee, and I think it's because of FHSAA's influence, but that's just my opinion. But they're resistant to change. They don't want to change. They've got a great system. They make over $5 million a year and have total say in what they do, and they don't want anybody interfering with that.
One of the things that caught my attention, you said just a moment ago, is how they, arbitrarily determine things by just the size of the school. And I know that's something we get here too, where, like I look at some of our lower levels, especially in football, where certain schools just dominate that. You can pretty much pencil them in as the champion before the year even starts. They could probably compete against some larger schools, and there's probably some larger schools that couldn't compete with some of those smaller schools just because of the way those schools are set up. How do you address something like that to make something everybody's happy with, aside from just saying, well, we'll go by the size of the school?
Well, again, what you said is exactly, the reason why the Sunshine State Athletic Conference exists, because they were tired of having to compete with teams that they had no business playing. Again, I think if you allow the schools to have more say in who they're going to be paired with and who they're going to play with in districts, I think that would resolve a lot of the problems. And I approached FHSAA last year with the idea that, listen, these conferences are the best thing that's happened to FHSAA because it's leveling the playing field and it's making it competitive for all teams. You should embrace that idea of what's happening, and allow that for all schools to participate in these private conferences and pair themselves together, and you're going to have a lot more parity. That's the one thing that's happened for the most part in my conference, is because everybody is like-minded. They all have the same beliefs when it comes to athletic programs and the way they put them together. There's a ton of parity, and the schools enjoy being a member of it, and that's why we've grown so rapidly. When I took over 2.5 years ago, I had 8 or 10 schools in the conference in one sport. We now have 4 sports, and if you counted all the teams, we're about 70 teams in all the different sports. It's because teams want to play with other teams that are on the same level. They want to have their kids have the opportunity to compete week in and week out and not get blown out 60-0 on a Friday night.
Yeah, that's no fun, is it, Stuart?
Well, you can't build a program that way,
no.
Dave. You just can't. I mean, who wants to go and play and get pummeled like that week in and week out? You have no spirit in the school. You have no attendance in the stands. I mean, not to mention the expense of putting on these programs. It just doesn't make it worth it, especially specifically for these small schools. One
thing I've noticed about Florida, they're pretty liberal on these national championships taking place. I know they had some football ones down in Florida. I think they're involved in the basketball one going up in Virginia now. Do you think that the money has kind of creeped in way more than it probably should in a high school organization like that that's the key for some of these not wanting to change, is that the financial dividends pay off pretty well if you're in an organization like the Florida High School Athletic Association?
Yes. Honestly, Dave, it's become all about the money. And let's be honest, over the last 10 years, the emphasis used to be on the NFL, and that's all you ever heard about when you talked about sports. And then college became huge, especially college football. Now it's trickled down into high school, where you see ESPN doing games of the week, and you see down here we have Bright House Sports Network. They cover all the games on Friday nights, and I mean it's become huge money, and that's part of the issue we're trying to get resolved with FHSAA is they see the money as well, and the sanctioning fees and what they're charging has become exorbitant to schools, especially in organizations like ours. Money has become huge in this business right now.
Before we let you go, Stuart, what will be the key for the survival of the Sunshine State Athletic Conference? What do you see down the road? You seem like the guy that has taken the roadmap from somebody started the idea, and you're moving it forward up to the 70 schools and all the sports. What do you see maybe in the next 5 years for your athletic association?
Well, it's really going to depend on what happens through legislature. If we don't get some relief, right now what we're doing is we're trying to seek out some remedies which basically tell us that we are allowed to join FHSAA by sport. See, right now the way that the policy of FHSAA is if you join for one sport, say you want to play basketball in FHSAA, all your sports have to become FHSAA members. Mm-hmm. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to break up that monopoly and allow schools to join the organization that best fits their programs. If that happens, we should be successful and continue to grow. If this gets shot down, we're going to become stagnant because we've really reached our growth potential. FHSA will not allow us to have a traditional postseason, which means we have to use our regular season for playoffs. We use our bowl game for our championship, which limits us to how many weeks we can play. So our growth is really pretty much at its max right now unless we get some relief from FHSAA through legislature.
So it's going to all depend on what the legislature